Welcome back to the channel, everyone. Hope you're all doing well out there. Today is going to be a build day, but it's not just going to be any build. It's going to be a build using the exact same hardware that I already have in my existing rig, but I'm going to be switching out cases. So before we get to the case, let me just rehash some of the hardware that I'm using in my daily driver. Alright, so I've got everything laid out and freshly cleaned. I guess we'll start from down here. The fans I'm going to be using in this build are the Antec Prism ARGB 120s. For memory, I am using a 2x8GB kit of Ripjaws 5 DDR4 at 3000 MHz CL15. For supplementary storage, I'm using a Kingston HyperX 240GB SATA SSD as a scratch disk for Adobe Creative Cloud apps. And for archiving and game storage, I've got a Western Digital 3TB RAID drive. The platform I'm using is a Gigabyte Aorus X470 Gaming 7 Wi-Fi. This is a really robust AM4 motherboard. It's got lots of connectivity, lots of NVMe slots to utilize. This motherboard is probably going to do me for the rest of the life cycle of Ryzen, unless something super hypey comes out in the interim. For a heatsink, I'm using the Scythe Mugen 5 Revision B, and this is sitting on top of a Ryzen 5 2600 CPU clocked at 4.1 GHz. For GPU horsepower, we are of course using the MSI RTX 2070 Gaming Z. I recently did a performance evaluation of this graphics card. I found it to be super good at 1440p, and yeah, it's a really quiet card, it stays cool, it overclocks well, and yeah, it's also the most powerful card I have on hand, so I'm going to use it. Finally, for the power supply, I am carrying over an Antec HCP 850 Platinum power supply. But now that you've seen the hardware and have probably gleaned what the case is from the box it's all sitting on, there's the case. We are switching over to a Fractal Design Meshify S2. Now, this is the first time in a while that I've used a Fractal Design chassis for this channel. Those of you that have been around for a really long time probably remember the last Fractal Design case that I took a look at, I believe, was the Core 500. And I'm a huge fan of Fractal Design cases. I just really haven't had the opportunity to build with one in recent history, what with all the moving around I've been doing. But all that's by and large in check now, so this video is going to be largely just my building impressions with the case, any of the pros and cons that come along with that, and in a follow-up video I may do some performance testing for some of the thermals that I encounter. So without further ado, let's get this build underway. So I just got all the stock fans removed from the case. These are Dynamic X2 GP14 fans. You do get 3 of them, and they're rated for about 1000 RPM. They are 140mm fans. The bearing feels nice and smooth on these, and based on my experience with Fractal Design fans in the past, I'm certain these are exceptionally quiet and probably move a decent amount of airflow considering they're 140mm fans, but for the purposes of my build, I am again using those ARGB fans that I already had, so I'll have to come back and revisit these another time. Alright, so let's just fast forward a couple of weeks now. I'm not really the montage-y kind of person. Sorry if you were expecting one. But I finally have the build completed, and I've been using this rig in this current condition for about a week and a half now. Now, this isn't necessarily a formal review of this case because this was purchased for my personal build. A little bit informal about it. I may not touch on all of the main sticking points, but honestly, if you want a full review of this particular case, go and look at a Define S2 review and listen to what the reviewer has to say about the interior of the chassis and the accommodations there, because by and large, most of that remains unchanged for the Meshify S2. I am, however, going to touch on my building experiences and my usage experiences with this chassis, starting with the build process itself. It was pretty effortless, if I'm being perfectly honest. This chassis has a tremendous amount of room for you to work with, so maneuvering things like motherboards, tall heat sinks, fat graphics cards, all of that really didn't give me any sort of trouble. Not to mention grommet locations for the hardware inside. They're set up in such a way that the Antec HCP 850 power supply that I used got pretty effortless cable management done just on the first go. Now granted, it's not the prettiest cable management ever, but it's a hell of a lot better than what I've been able to muster just off of a few stray minutes of haphazard cable management in chassis. And if I go back and focus on it a little bit more, I'd probably get it a lot cleaner and better organized than I already have it. There's also some fab I/O on the front of this chassis, giving you 2 USB 3.0 ports, USB 3.1 Gen 2 Type-C, and your obligatory audio jacks for headphones and microphones. Now, I've heard it said that the lack of USB 2.0 in the front is maybe a bit of a downside. I personally don't view it as such. If you think about how USB 2.0 headers are used on motherboards nowadays, most of the time we're using that for something like an all-in-one cooler's RGB lighting control, or we're using it for a USB expansion hub for RGB implementation. Basically, most of what we're using USB 2 headers for anymore is RGB. So the fact that there's one less cable coming out of my front I/O for me to have to manage, I like that. Also, the hard drive cages on the rear are actually pretty useful as cages, but what I was personally able to use it for, because remember, I'm not using the supplied fan speed controller that came with this chassis, I was actually able to use one of the cages to completely hide the hub that's used to control my fan's speed and their RGB lighting implementation. So even though it's sort of a rat's nest inside the actual cage, the fact that I can use that to cleanly tuck away my my lighting controller and the fan hub for my fans is pretty nice. And actually, there's probably enough room back there I could probably fit a second controller if I wanted to get even more fans in this chassis later on. Now, I of course did not try the vertical GPU mount with this chassis. I'm not water cooled, and my graphics card is nearly 3 slots deep. Those fans would be pressed right up against the glass, and even if I did feel like trying it out, I don't have the expansion ribbon that you would need to make it work in this particular chassis. I didn't give it a shot, but it's basically what you would likely expect, mainly for water cooling purposes. Now, as far as any of the issues that I have with this case, they're really pretty minimal, but I feel like mentioning them just because they are there. The first and probably foremost issue, and it's not even really a huge deal per se, but the front I/O is attached to the front panel. This means that every time you take the front panel off of the chassis, some of the cabling is gonna have to come with you. And unfortunately, if you want to keep things sort of flexible and maneuverable, that means there's gonna be this unsightly lump of cables that appears in the front of the chassis, like what I currently have in the front of this case. Visually, it's not very appealing, especially considering you can see so much of the interior of this chassis. But to be fair, the way I have it set up right now on my desk, this is sort of tilted more towards the camera so you guys can get a better view of the inside. But normally this isn't quite so severe with the angle. So I really don't personally see it, but I know it's there and it bugs the crap out of me. The front dust filter is also a little bit of a bore to get to here. You have to take out the bottom dust filter, which is admittedly nice and runs the entire length of the chassis, in order to reach the 2 retaining clips to pop the front panel out of place. I kind of feel like they could have used one of those spring-loaded clasp systems for the front panel, but considering the fact that this particular Meshify front panel is taller and wider than the Meshify V1 chassis, I can sort of see them wanting to go with a more robust solution here. But it doesn't change the fact that this dust filter is kind of irritating to get to. Now, as its namesake indicates, the Meshify is godlike with airflow. Even these Antec Prism ARGB 120s that I use on my chassis, which already moved a pretty decent amount of air in my outgoing Antec P8, effectively move even more in this case. And even with the increased distance between the front fans and the front of the GPU and the heatsink from my CPU, I'm actually experiencing delta temperatures of about 2 to 3 degrees Celsius lower than what I was experiencing in the P8. This difference might have been larger if we were dealing with higher airflow fans, since these ones are more optimized for static pressure, of course, and used on radiators. But the fact that I'm still getting improved temperatures, and as a result, the need for fewer RPMs, I'm getting just as quiet an experience as I was with the closed-off front panel of my P8, but I'm also enjoying better temperatures in the process. So I kind of call that a net win. If I had to comment on anything else with this chassis, is that part of the overall build quality and the experience of having this thing is the seamless way in which the paint on the metal sections of the chassis blend into the plastic for the front panel. You're actually kind of hard-pressed to tell that they are different substances until you get really close to them. And even then, the color matching between the two of them is really spot on in this instance. I actually got a comment from the Manic Misses on this, that this case is shockingly white. And I would have to agree with her. In certain lighting, it actually makes the white tabletop of my IKEA scar still look downright yellow. But that being said, with extremely white paint jobs and color schemes comes immediately noticing any imperfections on the surface. And unfortunately, with the glass side panel in my particular example, there was actually a minor scratch on the paint in between where the metal frame mounts to the glass side panel. And unfortunately, it's not something that I can really address myself, so I get to just sort of sit here and stare at that and know that it's there. Also, we're not entirely sure how it happened, but 2 days into owning this chassis, there are 2 black scuff marks on the front panel. They're extremely noticeable. They're really jarring for me personally to look at, but again, I have an anxiety thing going on, so take my impressions of that with a huge grain of salt. Also, I haven't really tried to properly clean them yet because I've been very busy with my day job and other projects that I've had going on, so it's likely I'll be able to get rid of most of these blemishes. But just know that if they do ever appear, you're going to notice them immediately and you won't be able to unnotice them. So that's it. That's my build update with building in the Fractal Design Meshify S2. It's a hell of a chassis, even if you do buy it at full cost. I have gone on record, admittedly, as saying that the Define S2 chassis, which this shares the chassis with, doesn't really need to exist per se, but I would actually go so far as to say, with the Meshify front and roof panels, with the same ease of access to different water cooling configurations in here and still being effective as an air cooling chassis, this is the chassis they probably should have released first and then just had the Define style front panel as maybe a bolt, like an aftermarket purchase for this chassis. But I don't know, maybe I'm a little off base there. What do you guys think? Hit me up down in the comments below and let me know. If any of you have used a Fractal Design Meshify S2 or any of the other Fractal Design chassis that share this particular internal layout, what have your build experiences been with them? Has there been any weird crap that you've experienced that maybe I didn't run into? Also, give the video a thumbs up if you liked what you saw, get subscribed for more content coming at you really soon, and I'll catch you guys next time. Take it easy.